They told me I was broken, that my body had failed its only sacred purpose. When the carriage pulled away from the only home I had ever known, I did not look back, for there was nothing left of me to see. I was 28 years old when I became a ghost. Not the kind that haunts corridors or weeps in mirrors, but the kind that moves through drawing rooms unnoticed, the kind whose name is whispered with pity and then forgotten. Eleanor Ashford, they called me once, with warmth and expectation. Then I became Eleanor Ashford, the barren wife. And finally, after the divorce papers were signed and the settlement paid, I became simply no one at all. My former husband remarried within 6 months. I heard she was 19, golden-haired, and already carrying his child. I did not attend the wedding. I was not invited. I spent that autumn in a rented room in Bath, watching the leaves turn and fall, feeling myself turn and fall with them. I had no family to return to, my parents having passed years before, and the friends I thought I possessed vanished like morning fog the moment scandal touched my name. Society has no use for a woman who cannot fulfill her duty, and even less for one who has been publicly cast aside. It was in that small room, with its fading wallpaper and the smell of damp wool, that I received the letter. The paper was heavy, expensive, sealed with dark green wax, impressed with a crest I did not recognize. Inside, the handwriting was precise, almost mechanical in its formality. Mrs. Ashford, it began, not Miss, a small kindness I had not expected. I write to you at the recommendation of Mrs. Violet Pembroke, who assures me of your good character and discretion. I am in need of a lady companion for my household at Greystone Manor. The position would require residence on the estate and attendance to certain domestic and social duties. The arrangement would be private, and your past circumstances are of no concern to me. Should you find this proposal acceptable, a carriage will be sent to collect you on the 16th of October. The compensation will be generous. Yours in respect, Nathaniel Gray, Duke of Ravensmoor. I read it 3 times before I understood it was real. Mrs. Pembroke had been a distant cousin of my mother, a woman I had met only twice in my life, and I could not fathom why she would think of me now, or how she had even known where to find me. But desperation has a way of silencing questions. I wrote my acceptance that very evening and posted it before I could reconsider. The carriage arrived precisely at dawn on the 16th. It was black, polished to a mirror shine, drawn by 4 dark horses whose breath steamed in the cold October air. The driver, an older man with a weathered face, said nothing as he handed me inside. I had only one trunk, containing everything I still owned in the world. As we rolled through the countryside, leaving Bath behind, I felt a strange calm settle over me. I had been cast out of one life. Perhaps, in this new place, I could craft another. Greystone Manor revealed itself slowly, emerging from the mist like a ship from fog. It was larger than I had imagined, a sprawling stone structure with ivy climbing its walls and narrow windows that seemed to watch our approach. The grounds were vast, bordered by ancient trees whose branches hung low and heavy, and in the distance I could see the edge of a forest, dark and dense. The air smelled of wet earth and wood smoke, and somewhere a crow called out, sharp and solitary. The housekeeper met me at the door. Mrs. Hartley was a tall, thin woman with silver hair pinned severely back and eyes that assessed me with neither warmth nor coldness, only efficiency. She led me inside without ceremony, through a grand entrance hall with marble floors and portraits of stern-faced ancestors lining the walls. The house was quiet, almost oppressively so, as though sound itself was unwelcome here. "Your rooms are in the east wing," Mrs. Hartley said as we climbed a wide staircase. "His Grace keeps irregular hours and prefers not to be disturbed before noon. Miss Cecilia takes her breakfast at 8 and her lessons at 10. You will join her for afternoon walks and evening reading. She is a quiet child, but she requires companionship." "And the Duchess?" I asked, immediately regretting the question. Mrs. Hartley paused on the landing, her hand resting on the polished banister. "She has been gone these 3 years," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "We do not speak of her in Miss Cecilia's presence. His Grace prefers it that way." I nodded, chastened, and followed her down a long corridor lined with closed doors. My rooms were spacious and well-appointed, with a large window overlooking the gardens. The furniture was dark and heavy, the sort that had been in fashion 30 years prior, but everything was clean and well-maintained. A fire had already been lit in the grate, and the warmth was a welcome relief from the chill that seemed to permeate the rest of the house. "Supper is at 7, Mrs. Hartley said. "Miss Cecilia will meet you in the morning room at 8 tomorrow. If you require anything, ring the bell." She gestured to a velvet pull by the door, then left without waiting for my thanks. I stood alone in the center of the room, listening to the silence. It was complete, unbroken even by the usual sounds of a large household, the distant clatter of kitchens or murmur of servants. I unpacked my few belongings, hung my 3 dresses in the wardrobe, and arranged my mother's silver hairbrush on the dressing table. Then I sat by the window and watched the fog roll across the gardens until the light began to fail. Supper was a solitary affair, served in a small dining room off the main hall. I ate alone, and the food, though well prepared, tasted like ash in my mouth. I was used to loneliness by then, but this felt different, heavier, as though the house itself was lonely and I had merely joined its isolation. When I returned to my room, I found a book had been left on my bedside table, a volume of Tennyson's poems. There was no note, no indication of who had placed it there, but the gesture touched me more than I cared to admit. I slept poorly that first night, waking often to unfamiliar sounds. The creak of old wood, the sigh of wind against the windows, the faint rustle that might have been mice or might have been something else entirely. In the darkest hours, I thought I heard footsteps in the corridor outside my door, slow and measured, pausing as though listening. But when I finally gathered the courage to look, the hallway was empty, lit only by the faint glow of a single candle left burning in a wall sconce. Morning came gray and cold, the sun hidden behind thick clouds that pressed low against the earth. I dressed carefully in my simplest gown, pinned my hair back, and made my way downstairs to the morning room. It was a smaller, more intimate space than the grand rooms I had passed the night before, with pale yellow walls and tall windows that looked out onto a rose garden, now brown and dormant for winter. A fire burned cheerfully in the hearth, and a table had been set with tea and toast and soft-boiled eggs. And there, sitting perfectly still in a chair by the window, was the child. She was small for 8 years old, delicate-boned and pale as porcelain, with long dark hair that fell in soft waves past her shoulders. She wore a dress of deep blue velvet, beautifully made but somehow old-fashioned, as though it had been designed for a different era. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, and she was watching me with eyes that were far too knowing for a child, dark and clear and utterly unblinking. "Good morning," I said, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet room. "You must be Miss Cecilia. I am Mrs. Ashford. I am very pleased to meet you." She did not answer immediately. She simply looked at me, her gaze moving over my face with an intensity that made my skin prickle. Then, slowly, she smiled, a small, secret smile that seemed to hold a meaning I could not decipher. "I knew you would come," she said softly. "I saw you in my dreams." Her voice was clear and precise, with a strange formality that children sometimes adopt when they spend too much time with adults. I smiled back, though something in her words unsettled me in a way I could not name. "Did you?" I said gently, crossing to take the seat across from her. "That is very interesting. And what did you see in your dreams?" Cecilia tilted her head slightly, considering. "I saw you walking through the garden in the rain," she said. "Your dress was wet, and you were crying. But you were not sad. You were looking for something." A chill ran down my spine, though I kept my expression calm. "I have only just arrived," I said carefully. "I have not yet been to the garden." "Not yet," she agreed, her tone matter of fact. "But you will. I see things before they happen sometimes. Papa says it is only imagination, but Mama used to say I had a gift. She said some people can see beyond the veil." She spoke of her mother without pain, only a kind of wistful curiosity, as though speaking of someone she had known long ago. I glanced toward the door, half expecting the Duke to appear and put an end to this strange conversation. But we remained alone. "That must be a very special gift," I said, pouring tea for both of us, my hands steady despite the rapid beating of my heart. "But perhaps we should not trouble your papa with talk of dreams and gifts. I am here to be your companion." to read with you and walk with you and keep you company. Would you like that?" Cecilia accepted her tea with both hands, her small fingers wrapping around the delicate cup. "Yes," she said simply. "I have been very lonely. The house is too quiet, and the servants are afraid to talk to me." "Afraid," I echoed. "Why would they be afraid?" She looked down into her tea, her dark hair falling forward to hide her face. "Because they think I see Mama," she whispered. "They think I talk to her ghost." I set my own cup down carefully, my mind racing. "And do you?" I asked, keeping my voice soft and non-judgmental. "Do you see your Mama?" Cecilia was quiet for a long moment. Then she looked up at me, and her eyes were bright with something that might have been tears, or might have been something else entirely. "Sometimes," she said, "but she does not speak to me. She only stands in the garden and looks at the house. She is waiting for something, but I do not know what." Before I could respond, the door opened and a man entered, and every thought fled from my mind. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in dark clothing that only emphasized the severity of his appearance. His hair was black, touched with silver at the temples, and his face was handsome in a harsh, uncompromising way, all sharp angles and shadowed hollows. But it was his eyes that struck me most, pale gray and cold as winter ice, the eyes of a man who had looked at grief and refused to blink. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, his voice low and controlled. "I am Ravensmore. I trust Mrs. Hartley has made you comfortable." I rose quickly, smoothing my skirts, suddenly aware of how plain I must look, how unremarkable. "Your Grace," I said, dropping into a curtsy. "Yes, thank you." "Your home is very grand." "It is very old," he corrected, a faint edge to his words. "Grand suggests beauty, and Greystone has little of that. It is merely large and cold and filled with the past." He glanced at his daughter, and something in his expression softened, just barely. "Cecilia, have you been entertaining our guest with your stories?" Cecilia looked at her father with perfect composure. "I was telling Mrs. Ashford about my dreams," she said calmly. "She does not think I am strange." The Duke's gaze snapped back to me, sharp and assessing. I felt pinned by it, examined and found wanting, though I could not say what test I had failed. "My daughter has an active imagination," he said, his tone making it clear this was a statement, not a topic for discussion. "I trust you will not encourage fanciful thinking. She requires structure and reason, not indulgence in fantasy." "Of course, Your Grace," I said, though I felt a flicker of something like defiance in my chest. "But surely imagination is not harmful in a child. It can be a comfort, especially when one is lonely." His expression did not change, but something flickered in those cold eyes, a brief shadow of pain or anger, I could not tell which. "You were hired to provide companionship and guidance, Mrs. Ashford," he said quietly, "not to philosophize on the nature of childhood. I suggest you keep to your duties." The words were a dismissal, clear and cutting. I felt my cheeks burn with humiliation, but I kept my chin raised. "As you wish, Your Grace," I said evenly. "I will do my best to serve your household well." He held my gaze for a moment longer, and in that moment, I felt something pass between us, something unspoken and unsettling, a recognition of some shared wound or sorrow. Then he turned and left without another word, the door closing behind him with a soft, final click. I sank back into my chair, my hands trembling slightly. Cecilia reached across the table and touched my fingers, her small hand cool and soft. "Do not mind Papa," she said quietly. "He is always angry, but he does not mean it. He is only sad because Mama is gone and he cannot bring her back. He loved her very much." I looked into the child's serious, knowing eyes and felt my heart twist. "I know what it is to lose someone you love," I said softly, "and I know what it is to be angry at the world for taking them away." Cecilia nodded, as though I had confirmed something she already knew. "That is why you are here," she said simply. "You understand. Mama told me you would." A shiver ran through me, cold and electric, but I did not question her further. I simply poured more tea and began to talk of other things, of books and gardens, and the small, safe topics that fill the spaces between strangers. And all the while, I could feel the weight of the house around us, pressing in, listening, waiting for something I could not yet name. That afternoon, after Cecilia had gone to her lessons with the governess, I walked through the gardens alone. The air was damp and cold, smelling of decay and distant rain, and the gravel crunched softly beneath my feet. The roses were all dead, their petals long since fallen, leaving only thorny stems and withered leaves. I walked past empty flower beds and overgrown hedges, past a stone fountain where no water ran, until I reached the far edge of the garden where a low stone wall separated the cultivated grounds from the wild forest beyond. And there, standing with her back to me, was a figure in white. My heart stopped. I could not move, could not breathe. The figure was slender, her long pale gown moving slightly in the breeze, her dark hair unbound and falling down her back. She stood perfectly still, facing the house, just as Cecilia had described. Then the wind shifted, and I saw that it was not a woman at all. It was only a statue, an angel carved from white marble, weathered and stained with age and moss. I let out a shaky breath, feeling foolish and relieved in equal measure. But as I turned to walk back to the house, I could have sworn I heard a sound behind me, soft as silk, like the whisper of a woman's dress moving through grass. I did not look back. I walked quickly across the garden, through the side door and up to my room, where I sat by the fire and tried to convince myself that I had imagined it all, that there was nothing in this house but grief and loneliness and the ordinary sadness of lives that had been broken and could not be mended. But late that night, as I lay in bed listening to the wind howl around the eaves, I heard the footsteps again in the corridor outside my door, slow, measured, deliberate. They paused outside my room, and I held my breath, my heart hammering against my ribs. And then, so faint I might have dreamed it, I heard a woman's voice, soft and mournful, speaking words I could not quite make out. When morning came, I told myself it had been nothing, only the sounds of an old house settling, the product of exhaustion and nerves. But when I went down to breakfast and saw Cecilia's calm, knowing smile, I wondered if she had heard it too. And I wondered what else this house would show me before my time here was through. The days that followed settled into a careful rhythm, like a dance performed by people who do not trust each other not to step on toes. I rose at 7, breakfasted with Cecilia at 8, accompanied her on walks in the afternoon, and read to her in the evenings before she retired. The Duke I saw only at dinner, where we sat at opposite ends of a long table and exchanged polite observations about the weather and little else. He was always courteous, always distant, as though I were a piece of furniture he had purchased and now preferred to ignore. But I felt his eyes on me sometimes when he thought I was not looking. And when our gazes met by accident, there was something in his expression that unsettled me, a kind of hungry curiosity, as though he were trying to solve a puzzle he had not intended to contemplate. I told myself it meant nothing. I told myself I was imagining things, that loneliness and isolation were making me see connections where none existed. But at night, alone in my room, I found myself thinking of him far more than was proper or wise. Cecilia, meanwhile, had become my constant companion and my greatest mystery. She was an intelligent child, precocious and strangely old beyond her years. But there was nothing unnatural in her manner except for the things she said, the small observations that should have been impossible for her to know. She told me once that I missed the smell of lavender because my mother used to keep it in her room. And she was right, though I had never mentioned my mother to anyone in the house. She told me the scar on my left hand came from a kitchen accident when I was 12, and again she was correct, though the mark was so faint as to be nearly invisible. When I asked how she knew these things, she simply smiled and said she saw them, the way one might see a painting or a landscape, clear and complete and requiring no explanation. I should have been frightened of her. Perhaps I was, a little. But more than fear, I felt a strange kinship with this lonely child who saw too much and was believed by no one. I knew what it was to be dismissed, to have one's truth denied simply because it made others uncomfortable. So I listened to her stories and did not contradict her, and in return she gave me her trust, which was a gift more precious than she knew. It was on the 5th day of my residence that I first ventured into the library. Mrs. Hartley had mentioned it in passing, a vast collection of books accumulated over generations, and I was eager to explore it. I found it on the second floor, down a corridor I had not yet traveled, behind a heavy oak door that opened with a groan of protest. The room beyond took my breath away. It was enormous, 2 stories high, with shelves reaching to the ceiling and a narrow gallery running along the upper level. Tall windows let in pale autumn light, and the air smelled of old leather and paper, and the particular mustiness that comes from knowledge stored and slowly forgotten. I walked along the shelves, trailing my fingers over the spines of books, reading titles at random. There were volumes on history, philosophy, natural science, works of poetry and drama and fiction. And there, tucked away on a lower shelf in a dim corner, I found a collection of journals, leather-bound and identical, each stamped with the Ravensmoor crest. I pulled one out carefully and opened it to the first page. The handwriting was elegant, feminine, the ink slightly faded, but still legible. "My name is Isabel Grey," it began, "and I am to be married in 3 weeks to a man I have met only twice. I am told I should be grateful, that he is handsome and wealthy and titled, and that many women would envy my position. But I confess I am afraid, though I cannot say precisely what I fear. Perhaps it is only the ordinary terror of leaving everything familiar behind and stepping into a life that feels like someone else's dream." I closed the journal quickly, my heart pounding. These were the late Duchess's private writings, her most intimate thoughts, and I had no right to read them. But even as I told myself this, I was opening the book again, turning pages, hungry for some glimpse of the woman who had lived here before me, the woman whose ghost Cecilia claimed to see in the garden. The entries were dated, beginning 6 months before her marriage and continuing for several years after. She wrote of her wedding, of her first months at Greystone, of her struggles to adapt to a household that was cold and formal, and utterly foreign to her warm, affectionate nature. She wrote of her husband with a kind of bewildered tenderness, noting his silences, his long absences, his inability to speak of anything that touched his heart. "He is like a house with all the shutters closed," she wrote. "I know there is warmth inside. I have seen glimpses of it, but he will not let me in. He will not let anyone in. I fear he does not know how." I read on, unable to stop. She wrote of her pregnancy, her joy and terror in equal measure. She wrote of Cecilia's birth, the overwhelming love she felt for this small, fragile creature who depended on her utterly. And then, in the entries from the final year, the tone began to change. The handwriting became more erratic, the thoughts more disjointed. She wrote of dreams, of visions, of a presence she felt in the house that watched her and would not be ignored. She wrote that Cecilia had begun to speak of things she could not possibly know, and that her husband dismissed it all as hysteria and nervous imagination. "I am not mad," she wrote, the words underlined twice. "I know what I feel. There is something in this house, something that wants to be heard, and I do not know if it means us harm or is simply crying out for help." The final entry was dated 3 days before her death. "I have decided to go to the old chapel tonight," she wrote. "Cecilia dreamed of it last night, saw me there, and said I must go, that someone is waiting for me there. Nathaniel forbids it, says the place is dangerous and half collapsed, but I cannot shake the feeling that I must. I will go after dark, when he is occupied with his ledgers. I will take a lantern and I will go, and perhaps I will finally understand what this house has been trying to tell me." The page ended there. I turned to the next, but it was blank. I flipped through the rest of the journal, but there was nothing more. She had gone to the chapel, and she had not returned. They found her body the next morning. Mrs. Hartley had told me in passing, fallen through the rotted floor of the old ruin. A terrible accident, a tragic loss. The Duke had sealed the chapel after that, forbidden anyone to go near it. I sat in the dim library, holding the journal in my hands, and felt cold all through. Cecilia had dreamed of her mother's death before it happened, and now she was dreaming of me. I returned the journal to its place and left the library, my mind racing. I did not know what to make of what I had read, did not know if Isabel Grey had been a woman driven to madness by isolation and grief, or if there truly was something in this house that watched and waited and drew the living toward their destruction. But I knew I could not simply ignore it. I had been brought here for a reason, whether by chance or design, and I intended to discover what it was. That evening at dinner, I decided to test the waters. The Duke sat at the far end of the table, cutting his meat with precise, mechanical motions, his face unreadable as always. I cleared my throat gently. "Your Grace," I said, keeping my tone light and conversational. "I visited the library today. It is a magnificent collection." He glanced up, his pale eyes meeting mine briefly before returning to his plate. "My grandfather was a scholar," he said. "He spent most of his fortune acquiring books. I am told he knew the location of every volume by heart, though I confess I have never had the patience for such devotion. I notice there are journals as well," I continued carefully. "Personal writings. They seem quite old." His knife paused, just for a fraction of a second, before resuming its steady movement. "The library is open to you, Mrs. Ashford," he said, his voice perfectly level. "You may read whatever you find there, but I would caution you against placing too much credence in the private musings of the unhappy. The past is the past, and it has no power over us unless we grant it such." It was a warning, politely delivered but unmistakable. I inclined my head in acknowledgement and changed the subject, speaking of Cecilia's progress in her lessons, the walk we had taken that afternoon, the small, safe topics that could not touch the wound I had inadvertently opened. But all the while I was aware of him watching me, and I wondered what he feared I might discover, and whether his fear was justified. Later that night, unable to sleep, I rose and wrapped a shawl around my shoulders. The house was silent, the servants long since retired, and the only light came from the moon filtering through the tall windows. I walked quietly down the corridor, not knowing where I was going, only feeling the need to move, to do something other than lie in bed and think of ghosts and journals and the dead woman whose husband I found myself thinking of far too often. I descended the main staircase and found myself in the entrance hall. The portraits looked down at me with their stern, judgmental faces. Generations of Greys who had lived and died in this house, leaving behind nothing but paint and memory. I was about to return to my room when I heard it, faint but unmistakable, the sound of a piano. The music was slow and melancholy, a nocturne I recognized but could not name. It seemed to come from somewhere deeper in the house, and without thinking I followed it. It led me down another corridor, past rooms I had never entered, until I reached a door that stood slightly ajar, warm light spilling through the gap. I pushed it open carefully and stepped inside. It was a music room, smaller and more intimate than I had expected, with walls covered in pale silk and a fire burning low in the grate. And at the piano, his back to me, sat the Duke. His hands moved over the keys with surprising grace, drawing out the melody with a tenderness I would not have believed him capable of. He wore no jacket, only his shirt and waistcoat, and his dark hair was slightly disheveled, as though he had been running his hands through it. He looked, in that moment, not like the cold, controlled man I had seen at dinner, but like someone who had forgotten to maintain his armor, who had let it slip just long enough to reveal the person underneath. I should have left. I should have withdrawn silently and pretended I had never seen this private moment, but something held me there, rooted to the spot, unable to look away. And then, as though sensing my presence, he stopped playing and turned. For a long moment, we simply looked at each other. His expression was unreadable, but I saw something flicker in his eyes, surprise perhaps, or something deeper, something that made my breath catch in my throat. "Mrs. Ashford," he said quietly, "you should be asleep." "I could not sleep," I replied, matching his hushed tone. "I heard the music. I am sorry. I did not mean to intrude." He rose from the piano bench and crossed to the fireplace, resting one hand on the mantel and staring into the flames. "My wife played," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "She loved music. After she died, I locked this room for 2 years. I could not bear to hear it silent. And now?" I asked softly. "Now I find I cannot bear the silence either," he said. "So I play, badly, and I try to remember what it sounded like when she filled this house with beauty." He paused, then added, almost to himself, "She was everything I was not, warm, open, full of light. I did not deserve her, and I was not surprised when the world took her back." I moved closer, drawn by the raw pain in his voice. "It was not your fault," I said gently. What happened to her was an accident. He laughed, a short, bitter sound. Was it? Or was it the inevitable result of bringing a creature of sunlight into a house made of shadows? She withered here, Mrs. Ashford. I watched it happen and I did not know how to stop it. And when she died, I told myself it was a mercy, that she was free of this place, of me. But my daughter looks at me with her mother's eyes, and I know she sees the truth. I killed her, as surely as if I had pushed her through that floor myself. No, I said firmly, surprising myself with the force of my conviction. You loved her, and love is not murder. Grief may make us feel responsible for things beyond our control, but that does not make it true. I stepped closer still, close enough to see the firelight reflected in his eyes, the tight lines around his mouth, the exhaustion that sat on him like a weight. You did not kill your wife, Your Grace, but you are killing yourself with guilt, and that serves no one, least of all the child who needs you. He turned to look at me then, really look at me, and I felt pinned by his gaze, examined and seen in a way I had not been seen in longer than I could remember. Who are you? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Why are you here? I am no one, I replied, echoing the words I had thought that first day. I am a woman who failed at the one thing society values women for, and I am grateful for a place to be useful, even if that place is haunted by the past. You are not no one, he said, and there was something fierce in his voice now, something that made my heart begin to race. You are a woman who has been treated shamefully, discarded as though you were an object with no value beyond your ability to produce an heir. And you have borne it with dignity and strength, and that is worth more than all the heirs in England. I felt tears prick at my eyes and blinked them back. You do not know me, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. No, he agreed. But I recognize the look in your eyes because I see it in my own mirror every morning. We are both ghosts, Mrs. Ashford, haunting the ruins of lives we thought we would live. Perhaps that is why you are here. Perhaps this house collects the broken things and keeps them. We stood there in the flickering firelight, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from him. And for a moment I thought he might reach for me, might close the small distance between us, and do something reckless and forbidden. But then, he stepped back, the mask of control descending once more over his features. You should return to your room, he said, his voice once again formal, distant. It is late, and you will catch cold. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, and turned toward the door. But as I reached it, his voice stopped me. Mrs. Ashford. I looked back. Thank you, he said simply, for what you said. It was a kindness I did not expect. I gave him a small, sad smile. We all need kindness sometimes, Your Grace, even those who do not believe they deserve it. I left him there, alone with his ghosts and his piano, and returned to my cold room. But I did not sleep for a long time. I lay in my bed and thought of his eyes, his voice, the way he had looked at me as though he were seeing me for the first time. And I knew, with a certainty that terrified me, that something had shifted between us in that music room, something dangerous and impossible, and utterly beyond my control. The next morning, I woke to find a note slipped under my door. The handwriting was the Duke's, precise and austere. Mrs. Ashford, it read. If you wish to understand this house and what happened to my wife, you may want to speak with Dr. Clement Ashford, who attended her in her final months. He resides in the village and keeps a private practice. He may be willing to discuss her case, though I warn you, he is an unconventional man with unconventional theories. The name stopped me cold. Ashford. It was my former married name, though I had no family remaining who bore it. Surely it was only coincidence. But even as I told myself this, I felt a thrill of unease, as though the threads of this mystery were drawing tighter around me, connecting things that should not be connected. I showed the note to no one, but that afternoon, when Cecilia was occupied with her music lesson, I asked Mrs. Hartley for directions to the village and permission to take one of the carriages. She looked at me with her usual inscrutability, then nodded once. You'll find the village 2 miles south, she said. Dr. Ashford's house is on the main square, above the apothecary. He sees patients by appointment, but he's usually willing to speak with visitors if they're civil. I wrapped myself in my cloak and took the small carriage, driven by the same silent coachman who had brought me to Greystone. The village was small and tidy, clustered around a stone church with a square tower and a graveyard filled with weathered headstones. I found the apothecary easily and climbed the narrow stairs to the rooms above. Dr. Ashford opened the door himself. He was a man in his 50s with graying hair and sharp, intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. He looked at me with curiosity, but no recognition. "May I help you?" he asked. "Dr. Ashford," I said, my voice steady despite my nerves. "My name is Eleanor Ashford. I am employed at Greystone Manor as a companion to Miss Cecilia Gray. The Duke suggested I speak with you about his late wife's condition." His expression shifted, something like surprise and wariness mingling in his features. "Ashford," he repeated. "Any relation to the London Ashfords?" "By marriage," I said. "Or rather, formerly by marriage. The connection no longer exists." He studied me for a moment longer, then stepped aside. "Come in," he said. "We have much to discuss, I think." His rooms were cluttered but clean, filled with books and medical equipment and strange instruments I could not name. He gestured for me to sit and poured 2 glasses of sherry without asking if I wanted one. "You want to know about Isabel Gray," he said, settling into a chair across from me. "The Duke's wife. May she rest. A tragic case, Mrs. Ashford, and one I have never fully resolved in my own mind." "What do you mean?" I asked. He took a sip of his sherry, considering his words. "She came to me 6 months before her death, complaining of visions, of voices, of a sense that she was being watched. Her husband believed she was hysterical, suffering from a nervous disorder brought on by childbirth and isolation. But I did not agree. The woman I examined was not mad, Mrs. Ashford. She was frightened, yes, and exhausted, but her mind was clear. She described her experiences with precision and consistency. And there was something else." "What?" I asked, leaning forward. "The child," he said. "Miss Cecilia. Even at 5 years old, she exhibited abilities that I could not explain through conventional medicine. She knew things she could not possibly know, saw things that were not there, or rather, that were not visible to others. I suggested to the Duke that both mother and daughter might possess a sensitivity to phenomena beyond our current understanding, that perhaps there was something in that house, some presence or energy that they were both perceiving." "And what did the Duke say?" I asked. "He forbade me from speaking of it again," Dr. Ashford said quietly. "He is a man of science and reason, Mrs. Ashford. He does not believe in ghosts or spirits or anything that cannot be measured and proven. And after his wife's death, he blamed himself, and he blamed me for not preventing it. We have not spoken since." I set down my glass, my hands trembling slightly. "Do you believe in such things, Doctor? In ghosts? In visions?" He smiled faintly. "I believe there is much in this world we do not yet understand. I believe that some people are more attuned to the unseen than others, and that dismissing their experiences as madness is both arrogant and dangerous. Whether what they perceive is truly the spirits of the dead or some other form of energy or consciousness, I cannot say. But I know what I observed in Isabel Gray and in her daughter, and I know it was real to them." I told him then about Cecilia's dreams, about the things she had said to me, about the journal I had found and the footsteps I had heard in the night. He listened without interruption, his expression grave. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he rose and went to a cabinet, returning with a slim volume bound in dark leather. "This is a journal I have kept," he said, handing it to me. "Observations on cases that defied medical explanation. Isabel Gray is in there, as are several others. I want you to read it, Mrs. Ashford, and then I want you to decide for yourself what you believe. But I will tell you this, if Cecilia is dreaming of you, if she is seeing you in situations that have not yet occurred, then you must be very careful. Her mother ignored my warnings, insisted on going to that chapel, and she died. Do not make the same mistake." I took the journal, feeling its weight in my hands like a talisman. "Thank you, Doctor," I said. "I will read this carefully." He walked me to the door, then paused. "One more thing, Mrs. Ashford. The Duke cares more than he shows. He is a good man, damaged by loss and guilt, but good nonetheless. If you can reach him, if you can help him see that his wife's death was not his fault, you will do more for that family than any medicine I could prescribe." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, and descended the narrow stairs. The carriage was waiting, and I climbed inside, clutching the doctor's journal to my chest. As we rolled back toward Greystone, I watched the landscape pass, the bare trees and gray sky, and I felt the weight of something settling over me, a sense of destiny or doom, I could not tell which. When I returned to the house, Cecilia was waiting for me in the entrance hall. She looked at me with her solemn, knowing eyes. "You went to see the doctor," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," I replied. "I wanted to understand what happened to your mama." Cecilia took my hand, her small fingers curling around mine. "Mama is glad you are here," she said softly. "She told me last night. She said you are the one who can help us, all of us, even Papa. But you must be brave, Mrs. Ashford. You must not be afraid of what you will learn." I knelt down so I was at her level, looking into those ancient, innocent eyes. "I am afraid," I said honestly, "but I will not run away. I promise you that." She smiled then, a rare, genuine smile that lit up her pale face. "I know," she said. "That is why Mama chose you." And before I could ask what she meant, she turned and ran lightly up the stairs, leaving me alone in the entrance hall with my questions and my growing sense that I had stepped into a story that had been written long before I arrived, and that the ending had not yet been decided. That night, I read Dr. Ashford's journal by candlelight, and with every page, I felt the truth drawing closer, cold and inexorable as winter. Dr. Ashford's journal consumed me. I read it through the night, and then again the following day, sitting by my window as the rain drummed against the glass and the wind rattled the panes. His observations were meticulous, clinical, yet threaded through with a sense of wonder that reminded me that even men of science must sometimes bow before mysteries they cannot explain. He had documented cases from across the county, instances of women who saw things others could not, children who spoke with the dead, houses where objects moved of their own accord and voices whispered in empty rooms. But it was his entries on Isabel Grey that held me captive, for in them I saw my own experience reflected as though in a dark mirror. "She came to me in March," he wrote, pale and trembling, insisting that something in Greystone Manor was trying to communicate with her. She described a sensation of being watched, of cold spots in certain rooms, of dreams so vivid they felt like memories. Most disturbing was her account of the chapel, which she felt drawn to despite her husband's prohibition. She said it called to her, that she heard weeping coming from within its walls, though the structure had been sealed for years. I urged her to stay away, but I could see in her eyes that she would not heed me. She believed, as her daughter believed, that there was a truth buried in that place, and that only by uncovering it could the house be freed from its haunting. The final entry, dated a week after her death, was the most chilling. I examined the chapel today with the Duke's reluctant permission. The floor had indeed collapsed, just as reported. But I found something else. Beneath the rotted boards, in the earth below, there were bones, old bones, not recently interred. I suggested an excavation, a proper investigation, but the Duke refused. He sealed the chapel more thoroughly and forbade anyone from speaking of it again. I believe he fears what might be found. I believe he knows more than he has said. And I believe Isabel Grey died not by accident, but because she discovered something she was never meant to see. I closed the journal and sat in the gathering darkness, my heart racing. Bones beneath the chapel, a secret the Duke was desperate to keep hidden. And Isabel, drawn there by forces she did not understand, had paid for her curiosity with her life. But what had she discovered? And why did Cecilia now dream of me walking the same path her mother had walked? I knew I should leave well enough alone, return the journal to Dr. Ashford, and content myself with my duties. But I had never been good at leaving mysteries unsolved, and this one had taken hold of me with a grip I could not shake. Besides, I reasoned, if there was danger in this house, should I not try to understand it, if only to protect the child in my care? That evening at dinner, I watched the Duke carefully. He seemed more drawn than usual, shadows beneath his eyes suggesting sleepless nights. He picked at his food without appetite and barely spoke, lost in some private torment I could not fathom. When the meal ended and he rose to leave, I found myself standing as well. "Your Grace," I said, my voice steady, though my pulse was not. "May I speak with you privately?" He paused, one hand on the back of his chair, and looked at me with those pale, penetrating eyes. "Is something wrong with Cecilia?" "No," I said. "She is well, but there is a matter I wish to discuss with you if you will permit it." He hesitated, then nodded curtly. "My study," he said. "Follow me." I had not been in his private study before. It was a masculine room, all dark wood and leather, the walls lined with books on estate management, law, agricultural science. A fire burned in the grate, and his desk was covered with papers and ledgers, the evidence of a man who buried himself in work to avoid thinking about anything else. He gestured for me to sit, and remained standing himself, leaning against his desk with his arms crossed, a position that was both defensive and commanding. "Well, Mrs. Ashford," he said, "what is it you wish to discuss?" I took a breath, committing myself to the course. "I spoke with Dr. Ashford in the village," I said, "at your suggestion. He was very forthcoming about your wife's condition and about his theories regarding this house." The Duke's expression hardened. "Dr. Ashford is a good physician with an unfortunate tendency towards superstition," he said coldly. "My wife suffered from a nervous disorder exacerbated by isolation and the demands of motherhood. Her death was a tragic accident, nothing more. And yet," I pressed gently, "he mentioned finding bones beneath the chapel floor. Old bones," he said, "that suggested something had been buried there long ago. Did you investigate further?" His jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought he might order me from the room. But instead he turned away, staring into the fire. "No," he said at last, "I did not. The chapel is unstable and dangerous. Whatever lies beneath it is best left undisturbed." "Even if it might explain what your wife experienced," I asked, "even if it might help your daughter understand her own gifts?" "Gifts," he repeated, his voice sharp with bitterness. "Is that what you call them?" "I call them a curse, Mrs. Ashford. My wife was tormented by visions that drove her to her death. My daughter speaks of ghosts and prophecies as though they are as natural as breathing. I will not encourage such madness by entertaining the notion that there is any truth to it." I rose from my chair, anger flaring hot in my chest. "It is not madness, Your Grace," I said firmly. "I have seen too much in these few weeks to dismiss it so easily. Your daughter is not mad, and neither was your wife. They simply perceive things that you cannot, and your refusal to acknowledge that does them both a grave disservice." He turned to face me, and I saw fury in his eyes, but beneath it something else, something raw and wounded. "You speak of things you do not understand," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You have been in this house less than a month. Do not presume to lecture me about my own family." "I am not lecturing you," I said, holding his gaze though my knees felt weak. "I am trying to help you see that denying the truth will not make it go away. Your wife died seeking answers. Do you want your daughter to follow the same path?" The words hung between us, stark and terrible. For a long moment, he said nothing, and I feared I had gone too far, that he would dismiss me from his service and I would be cast out once more into a world that had no place for me. But then slowly, the anger drained from his face, leaving only exhaustion and despair. "What would you have me do?" he asked quietly. "Dig up the chapel? Desecrate whatever lies beneath it? And if we find nothing, or worse, if we find something that confirms all the dark suspicions I have carried these 3 years, what then? How does that help anyone?" I moved closer, drawn by the pain in his voice. "I do not know," I admitted, "but I know that ignorance is its own kind of torment, and I know that your daughter needs to understand why she is the way she is, and that she deserves a father who does not fear her gifts." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something shift in his expression, the walls he kept so carefully maintained cracking just enough to let me glimpse the man beneath. "You are a remarkable woman, Mrs. Ashford," he said softly. "You have been cast aside by a world that values women only for their ability to bear children, and yet you stand here and tell a duke he is wrong. Most would not dare. I have nothing left to lose," I said simply. That makes me brave, or perhaps merely reckless. Or perhaps, he said, stepping closer, it makes you exactly what this house needs. Someone who is not afraid to look into the darkness and demand answers. We stood close now, closer than propriety would allow, and I could feel the heat of him, smell the faint scent of tobacco and wood smoke that clung to his clothes. My heart was hammering so loudly I was certain he could hear it. For a moment, I thought he might reach for me, might close the distance between us and do something irreversible. But then he turned away, putting the desk between us like a barricade. I will consider what you have said, he told me, his voice carefully neutral once more. But I make no promises. Now it is late, and you should retire. I recognized the dismissal for what it was and nodded. Good night, Your Grace, I said, and left before I could say anything more foolish or dangerous. But as I walked back to my room through the silent corridors, I knew that something had changed between us. The careful distance we had maintained was eroding, and I did not know if that was a blessing or a catastrophe waiting to unfold. 3 nights later, I woke to the sound of weeping. It was soft and muffled, as though someone were trying to cry without being heard, and it came from somewhere below my window. I rose and went to the glass, pressing my face against the cold pane, and there in the moonlit garden I saw her, a woman in white, standing among the dead roses, her long dark hair loose and wild around her shoulders. She was turned away from the house, facing the distant line of trees where the forest began, and her shoulders shook with silent sobs. My breath fogged the glass, and when I wiped it clear, she was gone. I did not hesitate. I pulled on my dressing gown and slippers and hurried downstairs, moving as quietly as I could. The house was tomb silent, not even the usual creaks and groans of settling wood. I slipped through the side door into the garden, and the cold night air struck me like a blow, stealing my breath and making my eyes water. The garden was empty. No woman in white, no ghostly figure weeping among the thorns, only the wind moving through the bare branches and the distant hoot of an owl. But as I stood there, shivering and uncertain, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Footprints in the frost-covered grass, leading away from where I had seen the figure standing. Small, delicate footprints, the kind a woman in slippers might make, leading across the garden and disappearing into the darkness beyond. I followed them. I cannot explain why, except that I felt compelled, drawn forward by some force stronger than reason or fear. The footprints led me past the fountain, past the overgrown hedges, to the far edge of the garden where the stone wall marked the boundary between the cultivated grounds and the wild forest. And there, half hidden by brambles and ivy, I found a gap in the wall, an opening I had not noticed before, just wide enough for a person to slip through. Beyond the gap, a narrow path wound through the trees, barely visible in the moonlight. The footprints continued along it, and though every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to return to the safety of the house, I pressed forward. The forest closed around me, dark and oppressive, the branches overhead blocking out the stars. I could hear things moving in the undergrowth, small scurrying sounds that might have been animals or might have been something else entirely. My heart was racing, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps, but I did not stop. And then, suddenly, the trees opened up, and I found myself standing before the ruins of a chapel. It was smaller than I had imagined, little more than 4 walls and the skeleton of a roof, the stones blackened with age and weather. The door hung crooked on its hinges, and through the opening, I could see the interior, littered with fallen beams and debris. Moonlight streamed through the gaps in the roof, illuminating the space with an eerie silver glow. And there, standing in the center of the ruined nave, was the woman in white. She was facing away from me, her figure perfectly still, as though carved from marble. I took a step forward, my foot crunching on a fallen branch, and she turned. In that moment, I saw her face clearly, and my blood turned to ice. It was Isabel Grey. I had seen her portrait in the entrance hall, had studied her features in the firelight, and there was no mistaking her. The same delicate bone structure, the same dark eyes, the same expression of infinite sadness. But her face was pale as death, her eyes hollow and shadowed, and when she looked at me, I felt a cold that had nothing to do with the night air, a cold that seemed to reach into my very soul and grip it with skeletal fingers. She raised one hand, pointing toward the floor of the chapel, and her lips moved as though she were speaking, but no sound came out. I stood frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe, as she pointed again and again, her expression growing more desperate, more anguished. And then, as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone, vanished like smoke, leaving only the empty ruins and the sound of my own ragged breathing. I do not know how long I stood there, trembling and terrified, but eventually I found the courage to move forward, to step through the crooked doorway and into the chapel itself. The floor was treacherous, rotted boards and gaping holes, but I could see where the collapse had occurred, a large section near the altar where the wood had given way entirely, revealing the dark earth beneath. I knelt carefully at the edge of the hole and looked down. The moonlight did not reach into those depths, but I thought I could make out pale shapes in the darkness, curved and white against the black soil. Bones, just as Dr. Ashford had said. But whose bones? And why had they been buried here in unconsecrated ground? A sound behind me made me whirl around, my heart leaping into my throat. But it was not a ghost that stood in the doorway. It was the Duke, wrapped in a heavy cloak, his face pale and strained in the moonlight. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "What in God's name are you doing here?" "I saw her," I said, my voice shaking. "I saw your wife. She was in the garden, and she led me here. She was trying to show me something." I pointed to the hole in the floor. "There are bones down there, Your Grace, just as Dr. Ashford said. Someone is buried here, and she wants us to know why." He crossed to me in 3 long strides and gripped my arm, not gently. "You saw nothing," he said harshly. "It was a trick of the moonlight, a dream, anything but what you think. Now come away from there before you fall and break your neck like she did." "She did not fall," I said, pulling my arm free. "She was drawn here just as I was drawn here, and she died because she discovered something that someone did not want discovered. What are you so afraid of, Your Grace? What is buried in this place?" His face contorted with anguish, and for a moment I thought he might strike me. But instead, he turned away, his shoulders bowing as though under a great weight. "My family's shame," he said hoarsely, "my family's sin. Let it rest, Mrs. Ashford. For the love of God, let it rest." But I could not. The mystery had its claws in me now, and I would not release it until I had the truth. "I will not let it rest," I said firmly. "Not while your daughter is haunted by visions she does not understand. Not while you are consumed by guilt for a death that was not your fault, and not while the spirit of your wife wanders this place seeking justice, or peace, or whatever it is the dead require of us." He looked at me then, and I saw tears on his face, glittering in the moonlight. "You do not know what you ask," he whispered. "You do not know what opening this grave will unleash. Then tell me," I pleaded. "Trust me enough to tell me the truth." For a long moment he said nothing. Then, slowly, he began to speak, and his words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples through everything I thought I knew. "My grandfather," he said, his voice hollow and distant, "was not a good man. He was cruel, tyrannical, obsessed with legacy and lineage above all else. When my father was 15, he fell in love with a girl from the village, the daughter of a blacksmith. She was beautiful and kind, and he wanted to marry her. But my grandfather forbade it. She was not of suitable rank, he said. She would contaminate the bloodline." He paused, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. My father defied him. He met with her in secret, made promises he intended to keep. And when she became pregnant with his child, he went to my grandfather and demanded permission to marry her. My grandfather refused. And then one night, the girl disappeared. No one saw her leave. No one heard her cry out. She simply vanished, as though the earth had swallowed her whole. "Oh God," I breathed, understanding dawning with terrible clarity. "My father searched for her for months," he continued. "He went half mad with grief and guilt. And then, on the night before his arranged marriage to my mother, his father took him aside and told him the truth. The girl was dead. He had killed her himself, strangled her to preserve the family honor, and buried her body in the old chapel where no one would ever find her. He told my father he had done it for his own good, to protect him from the ruin of a low marriage. And he told him that if he ever spoke of it, he would kill my mother as well. The silence that followed was absolute. I felt sick, horrified by the casual evil of it, the monstrous calculation. Your father, I managed. What did he do? He married my mother, the Duke said. He produced an heir, me, and another son who died in infancy. And then, when I was 10 years old, he rode out one morning and never came back. They found his horse wandering riderless on the moors, but his body was never recovered. Some said he was thrown. Others said he drowned in a bog. But I think he simply could not bear the weight of his father's sin any longer, and he chose to end his own life rather than carry it further. And your grandfather, I asked, died in his sleep 3 years later, unrepentant to the last, he said bitterly. He never acknowledged what he had done, never expressed remorse, and I grew up in this house knowing what lay beneath the chapel, knowing that my very existence was built on the bones of an innocent girl who had only wanted to love and be loved. When I married Isabel, I hoped to leave the past behind, to build something good and clean. But the past does not die, Mrs. Ashford. It waits, and it watches, and eventually it demands payment. And Isabel discovered the truth, I said softly. She dreamed of the girl, he said. She saw her in the garden, weeping and pointing toward the chapel. Cecilia saw her too, even as a small child. I begged them both to ignore it, to let sleeping ghosts lie. But Isabel was convinced that the girl's spirit could not rest until she was properly acknowledged, properly mourned. So she came here, against my wishes, to see if she could find proof of what I had told her. And the floor gave way, and she fell, and I could not save her. His voice broke on the last word, and I saw him shatter before me, all his control and dignity crumbling into raw, unguarded grief. I went to him without thinking, without hesitation, and put my arms around him as he wept. He resisted for a moment, then collapsed against me, his body shaking with sobs he had held back for years. I held him there in the ruins of the chapel, in the moonlight and the cold, and I felt my own tears fall for all the lost and broken people this house had consumed. The girl who had died for loving unwisely, the man who had killed himself for being unable to prevent her death, and the woman who had died trying to give her peace. When at last his tears subsided, he pulled back and looked at me, his face ravaged but somehow lighter, as though a great burden had been lifted. "What do we do now?" he asked, and I heard in his voice a terrible vulnerability, the question of a man who had run out of answers. "We give her peace," I said simply. "We excavate the chapel properly, with dignity and reverence. We identify her if we can, learn her name, and we bury her in the churchyard with a proper marker and a proper service. And we teach Cecilia that her gifts are not a curse, but a bridge between the living and the dead, a way to hear voices that have been silenced. That is what we do." He nodded slowly, his hand coming up to touch my face, with a gentleness that made my breath catch. "You are braver than I deserve, Eleanor," he said, using my given name for the first time, "and kinder than I have any right to expect. I do not know why you were sent to this house, but I thank God that you came." "I am only here because I had nowhere else to go," I reminded him. But my voice was soft, without bitterness. But perhaps that is reason enough. Perhaps we are all exactly where we are meant to be, even when we cannot see the purpose. He leaned forward then, slowly, giving me time to pull away if I wished. But I did not pull away. I met him halfway, and when his lips touched mine, it was like coming home after a long exile, like finding warmth after endless cold. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, a question more than a demand. And then it deepened, became something more urgent, more necessary, as though we were both starving and had finally found sustenance. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless, and the world seemed changed somehow, brighter and more real. "This is impossible," he said, but he was smiling as he said it, the first real smile I had seen on his face. "You are my employee. I am a duke. Society would crucify us both." "Then perhaps we do not tell society," I suggested, my own smile matching his. Perhaps we keep this between us, at least until we have resolved the mysteries of this house and given your daughter the peace she deserves. And then, when the ghosts are laid to rest, we can decide what comes next." He took my hand and raised it to his lips, kissing my palm with a reverence that made my heart ache. "Whatever comes next," he said quietly, "I want you beside me. Not as an employee, not as a convenience, but as my equal, my partner, the woman I choose above all others. I have been dead for 3 years, Eleanor. You have brought me back to life." We walked back to the house together through the moonlit forest, hand in hand, and when we emerged from the trees into the garden, I looked back toward the chapel and saw, just for a moment, a figure in white standing at the edge of the forest. But this time she was not weeping. She was smiling, and as I watched, she raised one hand in what might have been farewell or might have been blessing. Then she faded into the shadows and was gone. Cecilia was waiting for us in the entrance hall, wrapped in a shawl, her dark eyes knowing and serene. "Mama is happy," she said simply. "She told me you found the truth, and she said to tell you that love is not a sin, Papa, even when it comes in unexpected ways." The Duke knelt before his daughter and took her small hands in his large ones. "I am sorry, Cecilia," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I am sorry I did not believe you. I am sorry I tried to silence your gifts instead of helping you understand them. Can you forgive me?" Cecilia smiled and kissed his forehead. "There is nothing to forgive," she said. "You were afraid, and fear makes us do foolish things. But you are not afraid anymore, are you?" "No," he said, glancing at me. "I am not afraid anymore." "Good," Cecilia said, yawning. "Then can we all go to bed now? It is very late, and Mrs. Ashford looks frozen through." We laughed, all 3 of us, and the sound echoed through the cold halls of Greystone Manor like the first birds singing after a long winter night. And as I climbed the stairs to my room, the Duke's hand warm in mine and Cecilia skipping ahead, I felt for the first time since my marriage had ended that I was not merely surviving, but truly living. The ghosts were not yet laid to rest, but we had taken the first step toward granting them peace, and in doing so, we had found our own. The morning after our midnight confession brought a strange, quiet clarity to Greystone Manor. It was as though the house itself had taken a long-held breath and finally released it, allowing light and air to penetrate corners that had been closed for years. I woke to pale sunlight streaming through my window, and for the first time since my arrival, I did not feel the oppressive weight of secrets pressing down upon me. Nathaniel, I could no longer think of him as the Duke, not after what had passed between us, had sent word to Dr. Ashford at first light, requesting his presence and his discretion. He had also contacted the vicar of the village church, a man named Reverend Clark, explaining that human remains had been discovered on the estate and that proper ecclesiastical oversight would be required. Both men arrived by mid-morning, their faces grave but not unkind, and I watched from the window as they joined Nathaniel in the entrance hall, speaking in low, serious tones. I spent the morning with Cecilia, who was unusually quiet and contemplative. We sat together in the morning room, she with her sketchbook and I with my needlework, and for a long while neither of us spoke, but there was a peace between us that had not existed before, a sense of completion or rightness that needed no words. "Do you still see your mama?" I asked her at last, keeping my voice gentle and curious rather than fearful. Cecilia looked up from her drawing, a portrait of the garden in spring, full of flowers that did not yet exist. "Not as I did before," she said thoughtfully. "She is still here, I think, but not as sad. She feels farther away now, as though she is standing on the other side of a river and waving goodbye. I think she is ready to leave once the lady in the chapel is free." "The lady in the chapel," I repeated. "Have you seen her too?" Cecilia nodded. "She comes to me sometimes in dreams. She has dark hair like mine, and she is very young, younger even than you, Mrs. Ashford. She does not speak, but she shows me things. She shows me her life, how she loved Papa's father when he was young, how happy they were before the bad man took her away, and she shows me her death, though I do not like to see that part. It makes me sad." I reached across and took her small hand in mine. You will not have to see those things much longer, I promised. Your papa and I are going to make sure she is given a proper burial and a proper name. And then she will be able to rest, and you will not be troubled by such visions anymore." Cecilia smiled, but there was a wisdom in her eyes that was far beyond her years. "I do not think the visions will ever fully stop, Mrs. Ashford," she said quietly. "I think I will always see things that others cannot. But that is all right. Mama told me it is a gift, and gifts are meant to be used, not hidden away. Perhaps when I am older, I can help other people who are lost or afraid, the way you and Papa are helping the lady in the chapel." I felt tears prick my eyes and blinked them back. "You are a remarkable child, Cecilia," I said softly. "Your mother would be very proud of you." "She is proud," Cecilia corrected me matter-of-factly. "She told me so last night. And she is proud of you too, Mrs. Ashford. She said you have a brave heart and that you are exactly what Papa needs. She said I may call you Mama someday, if you wish it." The words struck me like a physical blow, so unexpected and so full of hope that I could barely breathe. "I would be honored," I managed, my voice breaking. "If your Papa agrees, and if you truly wish it, I would be honored beyond measure." Cecilia returned to her drawing, humming softly to herself, and I sat in stunned silence, holding her words close like a precious secret. It was too soon, too impossible, too fraught with social complications. But in that moment, I allowed myself to imagine it, a future where I was not merely a disgraced divorcee living on charity, but a wife and mother, part of a family that had chosen me not for what I could give them, but for who I was. By afternoon, the excavation had begun. Nathaniel had hired men from the village, men he trusted to be discreet, and they worked under Dr. Ashford's supervision, carefully removing the rotted floor of the chapel and exposing the earth beneath. I stood with Reverend Clark at a respectful distance, watching as they dug, their spades biting into the dark soil with steady, rhythmic precision. It took less than 2 hours to find her. The bones were shallow, barely 3 feet down, wrapped in what had once been a simple woolen cloak, but was now little more than fragments of rotted fabric. Dr. Ashford knelt beside the grave, his expression somber, and examined the remains with careful, professional detachment. But I saw the way his hands trembled slightly as he worked, and I knew he was moved by what we had uncovered. "It is a woman," he confirmed at last, his voice carrying across the clearing. "Young, perhaps 18 or 20 years of age. The bones show no signs of violence beyond the damage to the throat, which suggests strangulation. There are no other injuries that I can detect." He paused, then added quietly, "There is also the skeleton of an infant, perhaps 6 or 7 months in the womb. She was pregnant when she died." Reverend Clark bowed his head and murmured a prayer, his voice low and reverent. Nathaniel stood rigid, his face pale as death, staring down at the grave his grandfather had dug. I went to him and took his hand, and he gripped my fingers so tightly it hurt, but I did not pull away. "Her name was Anne Holloway," he said, his voice hollow. "My father told me before he died. She was 19 years old, the daughter of the village blacksmith. She liked to sing, he said, and she made him laugh when nothing else could. He loved her, and my grandfather murdered her for it. We will see that she is remembered," Reverend Clark said gently. "I will speak with her family, if any remain, and we will arrange for a proper burial in the churchyard. She will have a headstone, and her name will be spoken in blessing, not in shame. God rest her soul, and the soul of her unborn child." The men wrapped the bones carefully in clean linen and placed them in a simple wooden casket that Nathaniel had commissioned. We carried it in solemn procession through the forest and back to the house, where it was placed in the chapel that adjoined the estate, the small family chapel where generations of Greys had been baptized and married and mourned. Anne Holloway, who had been denied entrance to this family in life, would be welcomed in death, and she would rest among those who should have been her kin. That night, after Cecilia had been put to bed, Nathaniel and I sat together in the library, the fire burning low and the room dim with shadows. We did not speak for a long time, content simply to be near each other, to feel the solid warmth of another living person after so much death and sorrow. But eventually he turned to me, and I saw in his eyes a question he was afraid to ask. "Eleanor," he said, and my name on his lips was like a caress. "I must know. What we spoke of last night, what passed between us in the chapel, was it only the emotion of the moment, the shared intensity of what we had discovered? Or is there truly something between us that might endure beyond this night?" I reached for his hand, lacing my fingers through his. "It was not only the moment," I said honestly. "I have felt drawn to you since the first day I arrived, though I tried to deny it. You are everything I should not want, a duke, a widower, a man still mourning his lost wife. And I am everything society deems worthless, a barren woman, divorced and disgraced. But despite all of that, or perhaps because of it, I feel more alive when I am with you than I have felt in years. So yes, Nathaniel, there is something between us, something real and true and worth fighting for, if you believe it is." He brought my hand to his lips and kissed it, his eyes never leaving mine. "I believe it," he said fervently, "and I want to fight for it. But you must understand what that will mean, Eleanor. If we pursue this, if we marry, there will be scandal. Society will say I have taken advantage of my position, that you have seduced me for my title and my wealth. They will whisper that I have dishonored my first wife's memory by replacing her so quickly. And they will look for any excuse to tear you down, to prove that you are unworthy of the station you would occupy." "I know," I said calmly. "I have been torn down before, Nathaniel. I have survived scandal and shame and public humiliation. I do not fear society's judgment anymore. I fear only a life lived without love, without purpose, without the courage to reach for happiness when it is offered." He pulled me to him then, and I went willingly, settling into his arms as though I had been made to fit there. "We will wait," he said, his voice muffled against my hair. "We will observe the proper mourning period for Anne Holloway. We will see her buried with dignity and see that her name is remembered. And when that is done, when the house is at peace and Cecilia is settled, then I will ask you properly, before God and witnesses, to be my wife. And I will not care what society says, because I will have chosen you freely, and you will have chosen me, and that is worth more than all the approval in England." I tilted my face up and kissed him, soft and slow and full of promise. "And I will say yes," I whispered against his lips, 1,000 times yes. We sat together until the fire burned to embers, talking of the future we would build, of the family we would become, of the life we would create in this house that had been so full of death and was now, finally, learning to live again. And when at last we parted and I returned to my room, I felt lighter than air, as though I were floating rather than walking, borne up by hope and love and the impossible miraculous gift of a second chance. The funeral was held 3 days later, on a gray morning with mist hanging low over the churchyard. Reverend Clark presided with quiet dignity, speaking of mercy and forgiveness and the redemption that comes from acknowledging past wrongs. The village had turned out in surprising numbers, drawn by curiosity, but also, I think, by genuine compassion for the girl who had been one of their own. Dr. Ashford was there, and Mrs. Hartley, and even some of the older villagers who remembered Anne Holloway and her family. Nathaniel stood at the graveside with Cecilia at his side, and I stood beside them, and we were a family in all but name. He had chosen a simple but beautiful headstone, white marble engraved with her name and dates, and a single line beneath, "Here lies Anne Holloway and her unborn child, beloved and remembered, taken too soon, now at peace." As the casket was lowered into the ground and the first shovelful of earth fell upon it, I felt a shift in the air, a sense of something releasing, like a knot finally untied. Cecilia looked up at me and smiled, and I knew she felt it too. The restless spirit that had haunted Greystone Manor for generations had found its rest at last. After the service, as the villagers dispersed and the gravediggers finished their work, an old woman approached us. She was bent and frail, leaning heavily on a walking stick, but her eyes were sharp and clear. She looked at Nathaniel for a long moment, then nodded, as though coming to some private decision. "I am Anne's sister," she said, her voice thin but steady, "the last of the Holloways. I have waited 60 years to see my sister laid to rest proper. I thank you for this, your grace. It does not undo what was done, but it is something. It is more than I hoped for." Nathaniel bowed his head. "I am sorry for what my family did to yours," he said quietly. "No apology can make amends for such a crime, but I offer it nonetheless, and I hope that in time, old wounds may heal." The old woman reached out and patted his hand with her gnarled fingers. "You are not your grandfather," she said simply, "and the sins of the fathers need not be visited on the sons if the sons have the courage to make things right. You have done that today. Go in peace, Your Grace, and may your house be blessed." She turned then and shuffled away, leaning on her stick, and I felt tears streaming down my face, though I could not have said if they were tears of sorrow or relief or something else entirely. Nathaniel put his arm around my shoulders, and Cecilia took my hand, and we walked together back to the carriage through the mist and the silence. That evening, after Cecilia had gone to bed, Nathaniel came to my room. He knocked softly, and when I opened the door, he stood there in the flickering candlelight, his expression uncertain but hopeful. "May I come in?" he asked. "I know it is improper, but I have something I wish to say to you, and I would rather not wait." I stepped aside and let him enter, closing the door quietly behind him. He crossed to the window and stood looking out at the gardens, his hands clasped behind his back. For a moment, he said nothing, and I waited, my heart beating fast. "Eleanor," he began, then stopped and shook his head. "No, I am doing this badly. Let me start again." He turned to face me, and I saw in his eyes a vulnerability that took my breath away. "I know we agreed to wait, to observe propriety and decorum and all the meaningless rules that govern society. But I have spent 3 years living in the shadows, trapped by grief and guilt and fear. And you have shown me that there is light in the world, that there is hope and love and the possibility of redemption. I do not want to wait any longer. I do not want to waste another day pretending that I am not desperately, irrevocably in love with you." He crossed to me and took both my hands in his. "I am asking you now, tonight, to marry me. Not because I need an heir, not because I need someone to manage my household or care for my daughter, though you do both beautifully. I am asking because I love you, Eleanor Ashford, and I want to spend whatever years remain to me trying to make you as happy as you have made me. Will you have me?" I looked up into his face, at the silver-touched hair, and the pale gray eyes, and the mouth that had learned to smile again, and I felt my heart overflow with an emotion so powerful it frightened me. "Yes," I said, my voice breaking. "Yes, Nathaniel, 1,000 times, yes. I will marry you, and I will love you, and I will spend every day of my life proving that love is not a sin, but a grace, and that second chances are real." He kissed me then, deeply and thoroughly, and I kissed him back with all the passion I had kept locked away for so long. We stood there in the candlelight, wrapped in each other's arms, and I felt the last of my old life fall away, like a discarded cloak. I was no longer Eleanor Ashford, the barren wife, the cast-off woman. I was simply Eleanor, loved and chosen and whole. We did not speak of the practicalities that night, the engagement announcements and the wedding plans and the inevitable gossip. There would be time enough for all of that. Instead, we talked of dreams and hopes, of the life we would build together, of the love we would give to Cecilia and any other children who might need us, whether born to us or not. And when he finally left, hours later, I stood at my window and looked out at the moonlit gardens and felt, for the first time in my life, truly at peace. The next morning, Nathaniel announced our engagement to the household. Mrs. Hartley received the news with her usual imperturbable calm, though I thought I saw a glimmer of approval in her sharp eyes. The other servants reacted with varying degrees of surprise and, I suspected, speculation, but all offered their congratulations with apparent sincerity. And Cecilia, when we told her privately in the morning room, simply smiled and said, "I know. Mama told me it would happen. She is very happy for you both." We sent letters to the appropriate family members and solicitors, informing them of our intentions and requesting the necessary arrangements be made. There would be questions, of course, and raised eyebrows, and more than a few cutting remarks about the unseemly haste and the questionable suitability of the match. But Nathaniel had meant what he said. He did not care what society thought. He had chosen me, and I had chosen him, and that was enough. The weeks that followed were among the happiest of my life. We walked together in the gardens, planning where we would plant flowers in the spring, and where we might build a greenhouse for Cecilia's growing interest in botany. We read together in the library, sitting side by side with our books open, but often forgotten, too content in each other's presence to focus on the printed word. And we talked endlessly about everything and nothing, sharing our pasts and our dreams and the small, ordinary details that make up a life. Cecilia blossomed as well. The visions that had troubled her became less frequent and less distressing. She still saw things, she told me, but they were gentler now, more like glimpses through a window than overwhelming experiences she could not control. She had begun to paint her visions, creating beautiful, haunting images of gardens and spirits and moments caught between worlds. Nathaniel, instead of dismissing her work, encouraged it, and I watched with joy as father and daughter grew closer, their shared grief transforming into shared healing. One afternoon, as Cecilia and I walked through the rose garden, now carefully tended and beginning to show the first signs of new growth, she stopped suddenly and pointed toward the chapel in the distance. "Do you see her?" she asked, her voice soft with wonder. I looked, and for a moment I thought I did see something, a shimmer of white among the trees, a sense of presence that was neither frightening nor sad, only peaceful. "Is it your mama?" I asked. Cecilia shook her head. "No," she said. "Mama is gone now, truly gone. She said goodbye the night Papa proposed to you. But the lady from the chapel is still here. She comes sometimes to walk in the garden, but she does not weep any more. She is waiting for something, I think, but it is a happy waiting, like waiting for spring." We stood together in the winter sunlight, watching the place where the chapel stood hidden among the trees, and I felt a profound sense of rightness, as though all the pieces of a puzzle had finally fallen into place. The dead were at peace, the living were learning to live again, and the house that had been so full of shadows was slowly filling with light. That night, after dinner, Nathaniel took me aside and led me to the music room. He sat at the piano and began to play, and this time the music was not sad or melancholy, but bright and hopeful, a song of joy and new beginnings. I stood beside him, my hand resting on his shoulder, and watched his fingers move over the keys, and I thought of all the ways love can heal, all the ways broken things can be mended, all the ways endings can become beginnings if we are brave enough to let them. When the music ended, he looked up at me and smiled. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what Cecilia told us, about the lady in the chapel waiting for something. I think I know what she is waiting for." "What?" I asked. "Love," he said simply. "She died because love was denied to her, because the man she loved was forced to abandon her, and because his father chose cruelty over compassion. But we have proven that love can triumph, even in this dark house, even after so much pain. I think she is waiting to see that love can endure, that it can be stronger than death, stronger than shame, stronger than the weight of the past. And I think when we marry, when we stand before God and witnesses and choose each other freely and without fear, she will finally be able to leave, because she will have seen what she died for made real." I knelt beside him and took his face in my hands. "Then we will marry as soon as possible," I said, "not because of scandal or propriety or anything the world might say. We will marry because we love each other, and because that love deserves to be celebrated, and because there is a spirit in this house who has waited 60 years to see love honored as it should be." He kissed me then, soft and reverent, and when he pulled back, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Thank you," he whispered, "for coming here, for seeing me, for loving me despite everything. You have given me my life back, Eleanor, and I will spend the rest of it proving myself worthy of that gift." I smiled and kissed him again. "You already have," I said, "every single day." And in the distance, if I listened very carefully, I thought I could hear the faint, sweet sound of a woman's voice singing, soft and joyful, like the first birds of spring calling out that winter was finally over. The wedding was set for the first week of March, when the earliest crocuses would be pushing through the cold earth, and the world would be poised between winter's death and spring's rebirth. We chose the small stone church in the village rather than the grand chapel at Greystone, for we wanted our union to be a part of the community, not sealed away in the isolation that had caused so much pain. Reverend Clark would officiate, and the guest list was deliberately modest. Only family members who could not be excluded without causing offense, Dr. Ashford, Mrs. Hartley, and a few others whose presence would honor rather than judge. The weeks before the wedding passed in a strange blur of preparation and anticipation. There were gowns to be fitted, though I insisted on something simple and elegant rather than the elaborate confections society would expect. There were legal documents to be signed, settlements to be arranged, and endless correspondence with solicitors and relatives who had opinions about the match that they felt compelled to share. Some were cautiously approving. Most were scandalized. A few were openly hostile, writing to Nathaniel to warn him that he was making a terrible mistake, that I was a fortune hunter, that I would embarrass the family with my barrenness and my divorce. He burned those letters in the library fireplace and never once wavered in his commitment. "I am marrying you, Eleanor," he told me one evening as we sat together reading. "Not the opinions of people who have never met you and who value bloodlines over character. Let them talk. They will find some other scandal to fixate on soon enough, and we will be here, living our lives and raising our daughter and proving them all wrong." Our daughter. The words made my heart swell every time he said them. Cecilia had taken to calling me Mama Eleanor, a compromise that honored both her birth mother and our new relationship, and I loved her as fiercely as if I had borne her myself. She was excited about the wedding, helping me choose flowers and practicing her curtsy for when she would serve as my attendant. She spoke less of visions now, her gift channeled into her art and her quiet observations, and she seemed lighter, happier, more like the child she should have been all along. But as the wedding drew closer, I began to feel a growing sense of unease that I could not quite name. It was nothing concrete, no specific fear or premonition, only a sense that we were approaching some threshold, some moment of reckoning that would determine whether our happiness was real and lasting or merely a temporary reprieve from the darkness. I tried to dismiss it as ordinary nervousness, the natural anxiety of a woman about to embark on a second marriage after the failure of her first. But late at night, when I lay alone in my bed listening to the wind, I could not shake the feeling that something was still unresolved, some final test that we had yet to face. 3 nights before the wedding, I woke from a dream I could not quite remember, my heart racing and my skin damp with sweat. The room was dark, the fire having burned down to embers, and the only light came from the moon filtering through the curtains. I sat up, drawing my shawl around my shoulders, and tried to calm my breathing. It was only a dream, I told myself. Only the anxious imaginings of a mind that had seen too much strangeness and was now conjuring ghosts where none existed. But then I heard it, a sound from outside my window, soft and rhythmic, singing. I rose and went to the glass, pressing my face against the cold pane, and there in the moonlit garden I saw her, the woman in white, Anne Holloway, standing among the winter-bare roses with her face tilted toward the sky. She was singing, and though I could not make out the words, the melody was hauntingly beautiful, full of longing and sorrow and something else, something that sounded almost like hope. I did not hesitate. I threw on my dressing gown and slippers and hurried downstairs, moving through the silent house with the ease of long familiarity. I slipped out through the side door into the garden, the cold air hitting my lungs like a shock, and walked across the frost-stiffened grass toward the figure in white. She did not vanish as I approached. Instead, she turned to look at me, and I saw her face clearly for the first time, not pale and death-marked as it had been in the chapel, but young and lovely, her dark eyes full of a fierce, intelligent life. She stopped singing and smiled at me, a smile of such sweetness and sadness that I felt tears spring to my eyes. "You are Anne," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Anne Holloway." She inclined her head, a graceful acknowledgement, and then she spoke, and her voice was like music, like water running over stones, real and present, and undeniably there. "I have waited so long," she said. 60 years I have waited, bound to this place by anger and grief, and the injustice of my death. But you have freed me, Eleanor Ashford. You and the man who might have been my son's grandson if things had been different. You have given me back my name, my dignity, and my rest." I took a step closer, my heart aching with the enormity of it. "I am glad," I said. "You deserved so much more than you were given. You deserved love and life and all the happiness that was stolen from you." Anne's smile deepened, and she reached out as though to touch my face, though her hand stopped just short, a whisper of cold air against my cheek. "I had love," she said softly. "For a brief, shining moment, I had perfect love, and that is more than many receive in a full lifetime. What was stolen from me was not the love itself, but the chance to see it grow and deepen and bear fruit. And now I have watched you and Nathaniel, seen you find each other in the darkness, and I have seen what love can become when it is given the chance to flourish. That is enough. That is more than enough." She lowered her hand and looked past me toward the house, where a light had appeared in one of the upper windows. "He is a good man," she said. "Wounded and afraid, but good. And you are stronger than you know, Eleanor. You have survived what would have broken many others, and you have done it with grace and dignity. You will be happy together, I think. You will build something beautiful from the ruins." "I hope so," I said, my voice breaking. "I want that more than anything." Anne turned back to me, and her expression was suddenly fierce, urgent. "Then do not let fear stop you," she said. "Do not let the past, yours or his, cast shadows on your future. You are not your first husband's rejection, and Nathaniel is not his grandfather's sins. You are both exactly who you choose to be from this moment forward. Remember that, Eleanor. Remember it when the doubts come, when the world whispers that you are not enough, when the old wounds try to reopen. You are enough. You have always been enough." The words struck something deep inside me, and I felt a dam break, releasing tears I had not known I was still holding. I wept for the girl I had been, the one who had believed her worth was tied to her ability to bear children. I wept for the woman I had become, scarred but not broken, rejected but not defeated. And I wept for Anne, who had died too young and too cruelly, but who had somehow found the strength to wait and watch and bless the living from beyond the grave. When I could finally speak, I looked up to thank her, but she was already fading, her form becoming translucent, insubstantial, a shimmer of white against the dark garden. "Do not mourn for me," her voice came, distant now, like an echo. "I am going somewhere warm and bright, somewhere I have been kept from too long, and I will take with me the knowledge that love won in the end. That is all any of us can hope for." And then she was gone, and I was alone in the garden with only the wind and the moonlight and the distant sound of an owl calling. But I did not feel alone. I felt surrounded by love, held up by it, as though all the ghosts of Greystone Manor had finally laid down their burdens and left behind only their blessing. I turned to go back inside and found Nathaniel standing in the doorway, wrapped in his heavy cloak, watching me with an expression of wonder and concern. "I saw you from my window," he said as I approached. "I saw you speaking to someone, though I could see no one there. Was it her? Was it Anne?" I nodded, unable to speak, and he pulled me into his arms, holding me close as I shivered from cold and emotion. "What did she say?" he asked softly. I told him everything, the words tumbling out in a rush, and when I finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then he cupped my face in his hands and looked into my eyes with an intensity that made my breath catch. "She was right," he said, "about all of it. You are enough, Eleanor. You are more than enough. And I will spend every day of our marriage making sure you never doubt that again." We stood there in the doorway, wrapped in each other's arms, and I felt the last of the darkness lift from Greystone Manor like fog burning away in morning sun. The house was finally, truly free, and so were we. The wedding day dawned cold and clear, with a sky so blue it hurt to look at, and a sun that seemed to promise warmer days ahead. I dressed in my chamber with Mrs. Hartley's help. The housekeeper's usually stern face softened with something that might have been affection. The gown was ivory silk, simple in design but beautifully made, with long sleeves and a high collar that suited my age and station. My hair was pinned up with pearl combs that had belonged to Nathaniel's mother, a gesture from him that had moved me to tears when he presented them. Cecilia came to my room just before we left for the church, dressed in pale blue velvet with her dark hair in ringlets. She looked at me with shining eyes and handed me a small bouquet she had made herself, winter greenery and early snowdrops tied with a white ribbon. "For you, Mama Eleanor," she said shyly. "So you will have something beautiful to carry." I knelt down and hugged her, careful not to crush the flowers. "Thank you, darling," I whispered. I could not ask for a sweeter gift or a more precious daughter. She hugged me back fiercely, then pulled away and looked at me with sudden seriousness. "I saw Mama last night," she said quietly. "She came to say goodbye. She said she is leaving now, going somewhere far away where Papa's father cannot hurt anyone anymore. And she said to tell you that she is glad you are marrying Papa, that she has been waiting for someone like you to come and make him smile again. She said you have her blessing, and she will watch over all of us from wherever she is going." I felt tears threaten, but blinked them back. "I am honored," I said, "and I promise I will do everything in my power to make your Papa happy and to be the mother you deserve." Cecilia smiled, that luminous smile that transformed her solemn little face. "I know you will," she said. "That is why Mama chose you." The carriage ride to the village was brief but felt interminable, my nerves making every moment stretch. But when we arrived at the church and I stepped out into the cold air, I saw Nathaniel waiting at the door, tall and handsome in his dark coat and gray waistcoat, and everything else fell away. He looked at me as though I were the only person in the world, and in that moment I knew with absolute certainty that I was making the right choice, that this man and this life and this strange, haunted house were exactly where I was meant to be. The ceremony was simple and beautiful. Reverend Clark spoke of love and redemption, of second chances, and the grace that allows us to begin again. Dr. Ashford stood as witness, his face creased with approval and something that might have been fatherly pride. Cecilia stood beside me, holding my flowers when it was time for me to take Nathaniel's hands. And when the Reverend asked if anyone objected to our union, the silence that followed was profound and complete. "I, Nathaniel Gray, take thee, Eleanor, to be my wedded wife." His voice was steady and strong, and his eyes never left mine. "To have and to hold from this day forward, for better for worse, for richer for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death us do part." And then it was my turn, and I spoke the same ancient words, but they felt new and vital, charged with a meaning they had not possessed in my first marriage. "I, Eleanor Ashford, take thee, Nathaniel, to be my wedded husband." My voice did not waver. "To have and to hold from this day forward, for better for worse, for richer for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death us do part." Nathaniel slipped a ring onto my finger, a band of gold set with small sapphires that caught the light streaming through the stained glass windows. And then Reverend Clark pronounced us man and wife, and Nathaniel kissed me, gentle and reverent, and the small congregation applauded, and I felt a joy so complete it seemed impossible that I had ever known sorrow. We emerged from the church into brilliant sunlight, and the villagers who had gathered threw flower petals and rice, and children laughed and ran circles around us, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt not like a ghost or a failure or a woman defined by her inadequacies, but simply like a woman beloved and whole. The wedding breakfast was held at Greystone Manor, and the house had been transformed. Fires blazed in every hearth, flowers filled every vase despite the season, hothouse blooms brought in at great expense, and the rooms were filled with light and laughter and the sounds of celebration. Mrs. Hartley had outdone herself with the food, and even the servants seemed caught up in the festive atmosphere, smiling and efficient and clearly pleased to see their master happy again. Cecilia was everywhere at once, dancing between guests and chattering excitedly, her earlier solemnity replaced by the natural exuberance of a child freed from the weight of too much knowledge. I watched her with Nathaniel, saw the way he listened to her with full attention, the way he smiled at her jokes and praised her drawings, and I felt my heart expand with love for both of them. As the afternoon wore on and the guests began to depart, Nathaniel took my hand and led me away from the drawing room, through the corridors, and out into the garden. The sun was lower now, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, and the air was crisp but no longer bitterly cold. We walked in comfortable silence until we reached the far edge of the garden, where the stone wall marked the boundary with the forest. "Do you see it?" he asked, pointing toward the distant chapel. I looked, and for a moment I saw nothing unusual, but then I noticed the light, a soft golden glow emanating from within the ruined structure, warm and welcoming despite the gathering dusk. As we watched, the light seemed to intensify, growing brighter and brighter until it was almost painful to look at directly. And then, in a flash that left spots dancing in my vision, it was gone, and the chapel was dark and empty, just another ruin slowly being reclaimed by the forest. "She is gone," Nathaniel said softly. "Truly gone this time. I can feel it. The house feels different, lighter, as though a great weight has been lifted." I leaned against him, my head resting on his shoulder. "It does feel different," I agreed. "It feels like home." He turned me to face him, his hands gentle on my shoulders. "It is home," he said. "Your home now, Eleanor. Yours and Cecilia's and mine. And we will fill it with light and love and all the things it has been missing for far too long. No more ghosts, no more secrets, no more living in the shadow of past tragedies. From this day forward, we make our own story." I reached up and touched his face, tracing the lines around his eyes, the silver in his hair, all the marks of the pain he had endured and survived. "I love you," I said simply. "I love you and your daughter and this strange, beautiful, haunted house, and I promise I will spend the rest of my life proving that we are all worthy of happiness." He kissed me then, deep and slow and full of promise, and when we finally broke apart, we were both smiling. We walked back to the house hand in hand, the setting sun at our backs and our future bright before us, and I thought of all the paths that had led me here, the heartbreak and humiliation, the loneliness and despair, and I was grateful for every step, for without them, I would never have found this place, this man, this love that had saved us both. That night, after the last guest had departed, and Cecilia had been tucked into bed with a kiss from both her papa and her new mama, Nathaniel and I stood together in the music room. He played for me, not the sad nocturnes of earlier months, but something bright and joyful, a piece I did not recognize but that spoke of celebration and new beginnings. And when the music ended, he rose and took me in his arms and danced with me there in the firelight, with no audience but the portraits on the walls and the moon looking in through the windows. We danced until we were dizzy and laughing, and then we simply held each other, swaying gently, reluctant to let the moment end. "This is what I wanted," Nathaniel murmured against my hair. "This peace, this joy, this feeling that the world is right again. Thank you for giving it to me." "You gave it to yourself," I corrected him gently. "You chose to face the past, to acknowledge your family's sins and make amends. You chose to believe in second chances and to reach for happiness even when it seemed impossible. I am simply grateful to be here beside you." He pulled back and looked at me, his pale eyes warm with love. "We saved each other," he said. "That is the truth of it. You needed a place to belong, and I needed someone brave enough to shine a light into my darkness. We were both lost, and we found each other, and that is as close to a miracle as I have ever witnessed." I kissed him, soft and lingering, and when we parted, I saw that there were tears on his cheeks. We stood there in the music room, holding each other as the fire burned low and the house settled around us, and I felt a contentment so deep and complete that I knew I would remember this moment for the rest of my life. In the days and weeks that followed, Greystone Manor truly became the home we had promised to make it. Nathaniel and I worked together to brighten the rooms, replacing heavy drapes with lighter fabrics, opening shutters that had been closed for years, bringing in flowers and music and laughter. Cecilia thrived, her art becoming more confident and joyful, her visions rare and gentle rather than frightening and overwhelming. We began to receive visitors from the village, tentative at first, but growing bolder as they saw that the new Duchess of Ravensmoor was not proud or cold, but warm and welcoming. Spring came early that year, Or perhaps it only seemed that way because we were watching for it so eagerly. The gardens exploded with color, crocuses and daffodils and early tulips, and we spent hours planning new beds and borders, deciding where to plant roses and where to establish a kitchen garden for herbs and vegetables. Nathaniel hired a new gardener, a young man from the village who had a gift for coaxing life from reluctant soil. And together we transformed the grounds from a place of melancholy beauty to a riot of color and life. I found, to my surprise and delight, that I was not barren after all, or perhaps I had been, in my first marriage, made so by stress and unhappiness, and a husband who saw me as an obligation rather than a partner. But in the warm embrace of love and acceptance, my body began to respond, to heal, to prepare itself for the possibility of new life. When I realized I was with child, I wept, not from sadness but from overwhelming gratitude. And when I told Nathaniel, he held me and wept with me, and we marveled together at the grace that had been given us. Cecilia was overjoyed at the prospect of a sibling, and she spent hours planning what she would teach the baby and how she would help care for it. She painted a series of pictures for the nursery, bright and cheerful scenes of gardens and families and happy children playing, and we hung them with pride and promised her that her little brother or sister would treasure them always. The child was born in December, as snow fell softly outside and the house was warm with fires and love and anticipation. It was a daughter, small and perfect, with her father's pale eyes and my dark hair, and we named her Anne Isabel Gray, in honor of the two women whose spirits had blessed our union. Cecilia held her sister with infinite care and whispered to her all the secrets of the house, all the stories of the ghosts who had once dwelt here but were now gone, replaced by the living and the loved. And I, holding my daughter in my arms with my husband beside me and my stepdaughter curled against my side, felt a happiness so complete that it seemed to encompass the entire world. I had been rejected, cast aside, deemed worthless and unworthy. I had been brought to the edge of despair, to a place where I could see no future and no hope. But I had survived, and in surviving, I had found not just a home but a family, not just acceptance but love, not just a second chance but a life more rich and full than I had ever imagined possible. The ghosts of Greystone Manor were at rest, and the living had learned to live again, and that was the greatest gift of all. Years later, when my hair had begun to silver, and my children, for we had two more after Anne, a son and another daughter, were grown and beginning families of their own, I would walk through the gardens at twilight and remember that first night when I had arrived at Greystone Manor with nothing but a single trunk and a heart full of despair. I would remember the cold corridors and the whispered secrets, the visions and the sorrow, the moment when I had seen a ghost in the garden and followed her into the darkness. And I would remember the man who had been lost in his own grief, the child who had seen too much, and the woman whose death had bound them all to the past. I would remember how love had found a way, as it always does, to heal and transform and redeem. And I would give thanks every single day for the path that had led me here, for the rejection that had seemed like an ending but was really a beginning, for the courage to reach for happiness when it was offered, and for the grace that allows broken things to be made whole again. I had been rejected for failing to give an heir, cast aside as worthless and incomplete, but I had found a duke who saw my worth, a daughter who called me mama, and a house full of children and laughter and love. I had met ghosts and laid them to rest, faced darkness and brought light, been broken and become whole. And standing in my garden in the fading light, surrounded by roses and the sound of my grandchildren playing, I knew with absolute certainty that I had found exactly what I had been seeking all along. Not a title or a position or society's approval, but simply a place to belong, a family to love, and a home where the past had been honored and released, and the future stretched out bright and endless and full of promise. They had told me I was broken, but they were wrong. I had only been waiting for the moment when I would be called to exactly the place I was meant to be, to save and be saved, to love and be loved, to build a life from ruins and prove that endings are only beginnings in disguise. And that, I think, is the truest definition of grace.